all eyes are on what's happening in the U.S. presidential elections. It's Biden versus Trump, but there are huge question marks now over the capability, the mental faculties of the incumbent Democratic President Joe Biden. And it's been exacerbated by what we saw overnight at the conclusion of the NATO summit. Of course, the summit itself went on quite well for the incumbent U.S. President Joe Biden, but at the end of that summit, when he introduced the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, he mistook him for President Putin. Subsequently, in a press conference some hours from that, which was dubbed as the big boy press conference by the White House, he again mistook Vice President Kamala Harris and instead referred to her as Vice President Trump. It's very clear that Joe Biden, the incumbent President of the United States, the Democratic nominee to be president once again, is clearly not at the top of his game. His mental faculties are clearly receding. The question is, what will it take, A, for the Democratic Party to realize that he needs to be replaced as the official nominee, and B, more importantly, what will it take for his family, his closest family members, his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, his son, Hunter Biden, who've now formed a protective ring around him, to come to terms with the fact that perhaps they should leave their octogenarian husband and father alone and perhaps make way for a better candidate. But first, I want to bring you up to speed with the series of gaffes that Biden has made, not just at that NATO press conference and then subsequently at the big boy press conference, but what we've seen in the last month and a half, from the CNN presidential debate to the various sort of missteps that he seems to have taken, which has given an indication to the American voters, to the rest of the world, that the incumbent president is not quite right there.
Sleepy, crooked Joe Biden.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. You can beat President Putin. President Zelensky. Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, because I think she's not qualified to be president.
The world's eyes were on Joe Biden this week as he hosted the NATO summit in Washington, D.C. and addressed his first solo press conference in about 8 months.
For the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO.
And while Biden's performance wasn't as disastrous as the debate against Donald Trump 2 weeks ago, it has done little to ease concerns about whether the 81-year-old is capable enough to run for office again. One of the biggest gaffes was at a NATO event. Biden introduced Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky as President Putin, prompting loud gasps in the audience.
And now I want to hand it over to the President of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. You can beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
Biden quickly corrected himself, but the headline was already made. He later tried to justify the verbal misstep.
And the Putin piece, I was talking about Putin, and I said, and now, at the very end, I said, Putin. I said, no, I'm sorry, Zelensky.
Then later, at what the White House dubbed as a big boy press conference, Biden didn't even realize when he called Kamala Harris Vice President Trump.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, because I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one. The fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again.
While such slip-ups can't disqualify Biden from the presidency, it's making Democrats even more nervous ahead of the convention in August, especially since the president is showing no signs of stepping aside.
I'm determined on running, but I think it's important that I allay fears by let them see me out there. Let me see them out. For the longest time it was, Biden's not prepared to sit with us unscripted. Biden's not prepared to, anyway. And so what I'm doing is, and I've been doing, I think we've done over 20 major events, from Wisconsin to North Carolina to demonstrate that I'm going out in the areas where we think we can win.
He dismissed the concerns about his campaign that were posed again and again for a full hour by a room full of reporters and promised that he was fighting not for his legacy, but to finish the job he started when he took office in 2021. In a bid to reassure his party, donors and voters, Biden claimed he had passed 3 neurological tests.
Well, look, 2 things. 1, I've taken 3 significant and intense neurological exams by a neurologist. In each case, as recently as February. And they say I'm in good shape, okay? Although I do have a little problem with my left foot because it's not as sensitive because I broke my foot and didn't wear the boot. But I'm good. I'm tested every single day.
The press conference only gave Donald Trump more ammunition against Biden. In a post on his Truth Social site, Trump wrote, "I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president. Great job, Joe." Many Republicans believe that Trump's return to the White House will be easier with Biden at the top of the Democratic ticket.
Our victory was so absolute that Joe's own party now wants him to throw in the towel and surrender the presidency after a single 90-minute performance. They want Crooked Joe out of the race. It's a shame the way they're treating him. But don't feel sorry for him. He's a very bad guy.
After the press conference, more Democrats called on the president to quit. Amid growing unease within the party, former President Barack Obama and ex-House Speaker Nancy Pelosi have privately discussed concerns about Biden's campaign. Pelosi recently said it's up to the president to decide. We are all encouraging him to make a decision because time is running short. Peter Welch was the first Democratic senator to publicly call on Biden to withdraw. In an op-ed in the Washington Post, the Vermont senator wrote, "He saved us from Donald Trump once and wants to do it again. But he needs to reassess whether he is the best candidate to do so. In my view, he is not." Democratic donors have warned that funding for the November election effort is drying up because of President Biden's refusal to step aside. It's becoming more difficult for the party to tell voters to ignore the evidence that is right in front of their eyes and to argue that Biden is capable of being president until January 2029.
Making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
A disastrous presidential debate against Donald Trump has become a turning point for the Biden campaign, one which the president has been struggling to recover from. As he fumbled and mumbled his way through the 90 minutes debate, it became apparent that the 81-year-old's abilities are diminishing. But the problem for Joe Biden is that concerns about his age and cognitive ability started much before the debate. At the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of D-Day in France, Biden found himself in an awkward situation as he was seemingly searching for an imaginary chair. When Biden was welcomed by Italian Prime Minister and G7 host Giorgia Meloni, he was seen making a salute gesture to her. Later in the day, Biden made the same saluting gesture towards Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. When the G7 leaders were watching a skydiving demonstration, Biden was seen wandering away from the group and walking to one of the skydivers and giving him a thumbs up. And then Meloni redirected him to pose for a group photograph. At a campaign fundraiser in Los Angeles, Biden appeared to freeze and had to be guided off stage by former President Barack Obama. Then came the big blow, the face-off against Trump, in which Biden appeared incoherent for the better part of the debate.
Be able to help make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. Dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare, we have 1,000 trillionaires in America. Billionaires in America. And what's happening? They're in a situation where they, in fact, pay 8.2% in taxes. Now you're in a situation where There are 40% fewer people coming across the border illegally. That's better than when he left office. And I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we can do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
After the debate, the floodgates opened for Biden's gaffes. In a radio interview, Biden said, "I'm proud to be the first vice president, the first black woman to serve with a black president." Then Biden claimed he will beat Trump again in 2020.
Well, guess what? They're trying to push me out of the race. No! Well, let me say this as clearly as I can. I'm staying in the race. I'll beat Donald Trump. I will beat him again in 2020.
In an interview to ABC, Biden said, "If the Lord Almighty came down and said, 'Joe, get out of the race,' I'd get out of the race." Then came the final nail on the coffin. In front of several NATO leaders and the world press, Biden introduced Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as President Putin. This left Zelensky stunned and the room in shock.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
Thank you so much.
Hours later, and without batting an eyelid, Biden called Kamala Harris Vice President Trump.
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be Vice President, but I think she was not qualified to be President. So let's start there. Number one. The fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again.
Despite all of this, Joe Biden has made it clear that he is not going to exit the stage quietly.
So what was supposed to be a corrective mechanism, if you will, with first the NATO summit and then subsequently what was billed as the big boy press conference by President Biden, I'm not sure how well that's gone for the Biden campaign, but let's try and make sense of this. I'm now joined by Kayla Chashi. She is the CNN White House correspondent. Thank you very much, Kayla, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. First things first, how would you assess what the Biden campaign and the White House's feeling is after first the introduction of President Zelensky as President Putin and then mistaking Vice President Harris for Vice President Trump? What's the prevailing mood right now in the White House after those performances?
Well, they acknowledge that there were some gaffes that the president had when he introduced President Zelensky as Putin and when he confused Vice President Harris and Trump. But they point to a moment where he acknowledged the mistake with President Zelensky, and then later, when asked about the mistake for Vice President Trump, which is what he had said, he took a moment to say, listen to what Trump says, and then the campaign issued a tweet from Biden's account saying he knows the difference. One's a prosecutor, one's a felon. And they felt that they could really seize the narrative on those gaffes and that they weren't really make or break for the president. And they feel like, and this is the White House and the campaign's thinking, that the press conference went well, that the president was able to exhibit some personality, that he had some depth on foreign policy issues, and that he was even able to attack his opponent, Donald Trump, in more than a few occasions. But Democrats here in the U.S. had a very high bar for what they wanted to see from the president, and while they acknowledge that he did okay, it is not enough to stem the mounting pressure here.
I do want to know, there are separate reports from CNN, including that there is now polling to suggest, or at least they're viewing that polling, about how Vice President Kamala Harris would fare against Donald Trump if she were to be the nominee and if Biden were to sort of step aside. What are you hearing on that front? Is the Biden campaign sort of coming around to that view, or are they still continuing to be defiant that their man is still best placed to beat Trump?
Well, publicly, the president says that he is the most qualified person to be running in this moment, but he was asked specifically about the data surrounding his vice president, and he said and acknowledged that if the data were to show that in a head-to-head matchup, she would beat President Trump, then that would be something he would consider. But he said only if his team could also show him that he could not beat Trump, which is an interesting two-part answer to that question. Kamala Harris, to be the new nominee, so to speak, would not only have to prove that she could beat Trump, but also that Biden could not. So essentially raising the stakes for that decision to be made. And the campaign a few weeks ago, in the immediate wake of the debate, sent out an email to several donors showing some of the polling that they previously had, showing that Joe Biden against Donald Trump fared a couple points better than his vice president did. There are some reports that they're running new polling on that, but it's interesting to me that the campaign was willing to make semi-public the data that it had before, whereas the president is now saying that the polling would not show that he could not beat Trump, which is, in his mind, the condition that would have to be met.
I'll get to that in 1 second, but separately, CNN is also reporting that former President Barack Obama and former Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi have spoken overnight, and they're coming around to the view that the Biden campaign needs to stop and a better candidate needs to be made way for. How much of that pressure is going to sort of bring to bear on the Biden campaign?
Certainly that could bring a tremendous amount of pressure to the Biden campaign. Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker Emerita, is viewed as one of the most powerful people in this situation. She still wields a tremendous amount of influence over the Democratic members of the House of Representatives, and comments that she very calculatedly made earlier this week, where she suggested that Biden had not made a decision, where he had already communicated that he planned to continue running, seemed to reopen the door for reconsideration among many of her members. And there are also reports that there are many House Democratic lawmakers who have been weighing whether to back the president or defect from that position, and that Pelosi had signaled that she wanted them to wait until the NATO summit had concluded. That's why this weekend is so critical for Biden's presidency, because the fact that this summit is over, world leaders have left town, and now domestic politics are back in focus, and many lawmakers have been really contemplating this issue and now are faced with a decision to make.
Kayla, what's the view in from the vice president's office, from her campaign? We know Kamala Harris had a couple of campaign events in North Dakota, I think it was, where she seemed to sort of be walking the tight balance between, on the one hand, endorsing Joe Biden as the next Democratic nominee to take on Donald Trump, but at the same time, some of the phrases that she used about being unburdened about the burdens of the past and so on. What's the thinking there?
Well, the references to unburdened, she's used in the past to talk about the plight of Black Americans over the course of history. And so that, to me, was not necessarily a new message. Look, she's been an incredibly loyal foot soldier for the Biden presidency, and we do not expect that to change, at least over the next few days, with Biden still unapologetic about his decision to stay in the race, his commitment to a fairly grueling campaign schedule, going to Michigan today. He'll go to Texas and to Nevada next week. And so the Biden campaign is keeping the president front and center. He has said he knows he needs to allay fears of voters, of others in his party. And so Harris is being very careful not to step out of line on that message while he is still trying to make that case.
If in the event that Biden were to pull out of the campaign, step aside effectively, and I know that's a big if as of right now, but if he does do that, what may the contours of the Democratic race look like? Of course, Kamala Harris has a huge advantage because she's part of the incumbent, she's part of the ticket, but who may be the others that we're looking at likely?
Well, it's all still up in the air, and President Biden last night, when he was asked about whether a new candidate come in, he said they would have to start from scratch, which to a certain extent is true. Campaign finance law would allow much of the money that's been raised to flow to Harris herself because she's already a member of the ticket. But then there's a whole vetting process that would have to take place for a potential nominee to be her vice president. And then they would have to begin making all new ads, all new signage, start from scratch in that element, which would take take a little bit of time. Certainly, the Democratic National Convention begins in August, in the middle of August. 600 delegates would be needed to make a change, which is a fairly high bar, which is one reason why Democrats are suggesting if we need to make a decision on this, we have to do it soon so that we can unify behind another candidate. But there's still quite a lot of work to figure out if Harris were the person who would take over the top of the ticket, who that number 2 would be.
All right, Kayla Tausche, thank you very much for joining us with your thoughts and perspective on what's been going on with the Democratic campaign. As of right now, it seems like Joe Biden is digging his heels in. He wants to ensure that the entire Democratic Party, the delegates, the donors, and everyone is rallying around him. He is currently, at least from whatever indications we're getting, as Kayla was saying, from the Biden campaign, he's not in a mood to give up his campaign, and there has to be something substantial offered to him if that were to come to pass. We'll see how that plays out, but it's clear from whatever we've seen at the NATO summit, the introduction of President Zelensky as President Putin, and then, of course, in the press conference, which was dubbed as the big boy press conference, where Biden confused Kamala Harris for Trump, referring to him as Vice President Trump. It's clear that he's not at the top of his game. Whether or not that will force a change in the Democratic nominee, we'll have to wait and see. But it's apparent that he's not really up there.